Hey everybody, this is Amie Clark with theseniorlist.com, and today I'm having a video chat with Nurse Cynthia. This is the first video chat where we haven't been able to be in the same room as we are both practicing our social distancing skills. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean we can't get together and talk about some really important topics. Today, we are going to be talking about transitioning into a care setting from home. This can be kind of a loaded topic because most people don't want to leave their home. They don't want to move into a care setting. No, they don't. So today, Cynthia and I are going to talk about some strategies that families can use, some indicators to know when it's time. It really is time to make that change from home into a care setting, and some other useful tips and insights from Nurse Cynthia, since she is an expert at this topic. So welcome, Cynthia. Thank you so much for joining me virtually today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to share what knowledge I have and hopefully help kind of bridge that gap for our senior citizens and give them some knowledge about when it's a good time to make some of those difficult decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my first question, and I remember working in placement and referral when we were helping people find senior housing. I got this question a lot, especially in times where it wasn't in a crisis scenario, when people had a little bit of time.
Yeah. People
would always ask, how do I know when the time is right to move my loved one into, whatever level of care they were looking into? So how do you know when it's the right time?
Yeah, I think that, it's never too early to start having that discussion, and having that discussion also with your loved one as to when they feel they might be ready, and being very open and honest about that subject. And I think we tend to get a little nervous about those types of subjects, and we're afraid to bring them up with our loved one, and then we wait and a crisis occurs, and it can make it a lot more stressful and difficult. From a nursing perspective, I think definitely there are some really important things to consider when you're looking at when it's time to transition to a care setting. And it definitely focuses around safety first and foremost. And then obviously there's a really important issue of caregiver burnout. When I think of home care, transitioning from a home care setting into a community setting, typically what I see is a couple of different scenarios. A lot of times you have older adults that are taking care of themselves at home, and family might be supplementing that situation or just checking in, but the individual is living independently and alone. And then I also see where you have an older adult that's being cared for either by possibly a family member, which is typically going to be a spouse or a child, adult child. I've seen nieces and nephews and things. And so, it can kind of present itself in two different situations. Definitely, when somebody's taking care of themselves in their own home, that can be a time when you really need to kind of get a jump on it, because someone can have a change in their mental status that seems maybe gradual over time, but all of a sudden it presents one day and you're going, oh, I don't know how well they're doing in their home. Typically, if somebody's being cared for by their spouse or an adult child, they might notice things a little bit sooner. And so they might have a little bit more lead time and a little bit more knowledge that, hey, we're kind of starting to head down that road. And I think when I see folks that are living independently on their own and taking care of themselves, that's most often, in my experience, where kind of a crisis occurs. They end up in the hospital, and the hospital says, hey, they're not safe to go back home because an incident occurred. There was a fall where they were down or something like that. And so in either one of those scenarios, it definitely is about safety of the individual, safety of the person that's caring for that individual, And then burnout for the person that's providing the care if there's somebody giving full-time care in the home. For individuals that have cognitive impairment, obviously there's multiple layers of safety concerns there. But when I say safety, it can be anything from, somebody living alone, taking care of themselves, and they have a fall, or they're not eating and drinking like they should. I see that often, where a family member is checking in on someone and finding that there's no fresh food in the house and the food in the refrigerator is old. They can't tell if that person's been taking their medications. Maybe there was a fall, they were unattended for a couple of hours before they realized they needed to press their safety button, or they were able to get to their phone. And so those kind of issues are pretty urgent. And I think that if you check in often and you actually go to the home and you ask questions and you look around, there's going to be little telltale signs that things are heading in that direction before it becomes a crisis. And then in the opposite scenario, when you have an adult caregiver, either the spouse or the family member, whomever, caring for that person, that individual that's providing care needs to be able to provide that care on a 24-hour basis, 7 days a week. And so, there can be situations where the caregiver needs to take a shower, and maybe an incident happens while they're in the shower, or they take a nap, or they run an errand. And so what we'll see in those situations is, from a safety perspective, maybe somebody tries to cook something in a microwave and they cook it too long, or they leave the stove on, or the oven on, they leave an iron on, we see things like that. And so there's a lot of trouble we can get into as grown adults in the home situation when we have a little bit of cognitive impairment, but we're still physically capable of doing a lot of our activities of daily living ourselves. And then as far as caregiver burnout, just living in a scenario where you are 24/7 providing care to someone is very physically demanding on your body. Needing to be able to assist a loved one in the home with things like transfers, bathing, dressing. It's very physically taxing. And then there's just the emotional aspect of really needing to be on call 24 hours a day to monitor that person, make sure they're getting their meals. And it can take a toll on an older adult that's providing care, that's maybe the spouse. And they've got arthritis and they've got health issues. One thing I do know is that oftentimes a spouse will, understandably go to the end of the earth to provide that care in the home for their loved one. And they might be doing an absolutely perfect job and an amazing job, but they're tired and their back is hurting and they're emotionally overloaded. And so when you're starting to see those things happen in the home, whether it's caregiver burnout, or you're starting to see those safety issues that are coming up and self-care issues that are coming up, it's time to definitely start having that conversation. And hopefully you've had that conversation, excuse me, ahead of time. But once you're to that point, if you can't problem solve and bring in some relief or make the home more safe, then it's time to start looking into a community care setting.
Yeah, I remember one of the things that we used to share with families was the analogy that if your loved one was in their home and there was a fire in the home, would they be able to get out safely on their own? Yeah. And if there was any question as to whether or not they could exit the home if it was on fire, then that to me was always a pretty definitive line where families could then look at it from that perspective and say, oh, you're right. They're not safe in their home. Something needs to change. And then to your point about caregiver burnout, there are so many spouses that are doing that full-time caregiving of their loved one. and like you said, doing an amazing job at it. But then what happens, and I know that you've seen this a ton, is something happens to the caregiver. And then the whole thing falls apart because the caregiver is sick or in the hospital because they're so exhausted emotionally and physically. And then the person that they were caring for is now in crisis because their person is no longer there. So it's just to your point that those conversations need to be happening if there are those signs, and they need to be ongoing, because chances are one conversation about the transition into senior care, one conversation isn't going to be the end of it. It needs to be an ongoing, continual conversation that people are having with their loved ones.
And it's even something that we can dialogue with our children now at this point in our lives.
That's a great point. Yes.
You know, I know my parents are in their late 60s, but it's a conversation that we've even had. You know, I want to know when they feel it's time, and what their thoughts are on care within a community, and really just establish that dialogue early on. And then one more thing that I didn't address, back to safety, is clearly individuals either being cared for by a spouse or child, or individuals living on their own, caring for themselves, whether or not they're safe to leave their home, to go out in the community for a walk, to go to the grocery store. That tends to be a common scenario that happens and becomes a crisis, because mom or dad could go to the store, same route every day in the same car for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden one day they get lost and they're either on foot or they're in their car, but they don't know how to get back. Yeah. And when there's a caregiver in the home providing care, they can fall asleep at night. Obviously they have to sleep, and somebody wakes up in the middle of the night, their loved one, and they're confused. They've lost track of time, and they wander outside of the home.
Yeah.
And so those are also difficult situations that would indicate it's time, definitely time for care in a community. And then also I have experienced family members taking care of their loved one in the home, and the loved one has pretty significant cognitive impairment. And I've seen situations where behaviors become unmanageable for the caregiver, and it can be violent behaviors and anger and resistance to care, and it really becomes a safety issue for the person that's giving the care, and then the person that's also receiving the care, because that's difficult roads to navigate in the home setting when you don't specialize in that level of care, and I have seen some really tough scenarios there. And then it obviously makes it even more difficult to find a care setting at that point.
Oh, absolutely. To find a care setting that's willing to take that on right off the bat. That leads to my next question. When should families start the search for a senior care setting, and finding the right options for their loved one? When does that need to happen?
I think we kind of touched on that. I mean, earlier the better. Start the dialogue. As time goes on, obviously your loved one is aging, their health conditions are progressing. If they have some cognitive impairment, that's likely progressing as well. And so what you see and what you're looking into right now might not be what that individual needs in 6 months. And so, especially for individuals with cognitive impairment, I think that folks can change rapidly, in that area. And so you could have discussions early on, and you could be looking at a community that has assisted living. And in 6 months, some of these safety issues are coming up, and it might be recommended that they're not appropriate for assisted living, and they may need memory care. So I think it's important to not only have that dialogue with our loved ones early on, but also to stay very open to what level of care might be needed, and in particular with individuals with cognitive impairment, because things can change for them. And ideally we are all able to stay in our home as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could start that process, and 2 or 3 years down the road, it's finally time for that change to occur. And it might not be appropriate to do you might be originally talking about maybe independent living, in a senior care community. By the time everything plays out and that person's been able to age in their home for several years, like I said, they may need assisted living or they may need memory care. So it's a great idea to start looking early. Sometimes when you're out in the community, you drive by a campus, you can say, hey, do you want to stop in and maybe take a look at that place? It's a tedious process when you're looking and you need to find something right away. It can consume all of your time, and it can become a huge stressor. The sooner that you can have that conversation with your loved one and start developing a plan, getting into different communities and just getting basic information about what services they provide, what levels of care they provide, what type of a financial situation it would mean, because that's really important to know. It can be quite shocking to find out what, senior care costs out there in the community. And so getting as much information as you can and allowing your loved one to participate, even if they're very resistant.
Yeah.
Giving them as much time as possible to digest and process a possible change in the future. And then for individuals with cognitive impairment, finding out what they want and how they feel about care in a community while they're able to have that conversation with you is really important, because I know family members and loved ones want to do what's right and what their loved one would want, and they want to do right by that person. And so finding out really what that person would want versus a big setting versus a small setting, and things like that early on when they're still able to have those discussions with you, it's really important.
For sure. And for people watching this video, if you haven't already seen it, Cynthia and I did a video recently about how to find the right assisted living for your loved ones. So I'm going to insert the link to that video in our description, so be sure to check that out as well. So what happens, Cynthia, if someone is clearly unsafe in their home? It's recognized by family members or professional caregivers, physicians. This person should not be in their home, but they refuse to leave. What happens in those scenarios?
That comes up.
A perfect answer there. So
yeah, that comes up often. It's a grieving process to leave our home, and it's a to say the least a major life change.
Yeah.
People definitely have rights. They do have the right to sort of fail in place. I mean, we all every day have the ability to make our own decision, whether we're going to wear our seatbelt, whether we're going to follow the speed limit, how we're going to treat our body, what we're going to eat and drink. And so those rights definitely extend to senior citizens in difficult situations. What I do know is that if you can get them information early on and try and focus on the positive and how this is going to enhance their lives. Sometimes, people are feeling isolated. They might not be aware of it. And if you can highlight the different types of activities and the things that they're going to be able to let go of, that they no longer have to worry about. If they can take a tour and go into a community and eat a meal and things like that, sometimes that'll help kind of win them over. We all have an image in our mind of what we think assisted care, and community care out in the community, in these communities, is going to be. And oftentimes, once folks kind of get in there and they start talking to the staff members and they take a tour and they have a meal and they're thinking, wow, this can be really nice. Mm-hmm. If that's not the case, though, you really need to get support. You need to get support from their physician. I don't know how many times I've seen scenarios where a senior is not willing to budge, but as soon as their physician says to them,
yeah,
you are not safe and you can't stay at home anymore, the doctor has spoken or the care provider has spoken, and they take that as gold. Yeah. And that's a huge relief. And it's nice in those situations because it takes a little bit of the burden and of maybe feeling like you're the bad guy off of the family member and the loved ones. I love to talk to folks that are resistant to coming into a community, because sometimes once I start talking to them and I can explain it from an outside perspective, how this is going to benefit their lives, how this is going to benefit their loved ones' lives, their loved ones can feel secure that they're safe now. It's those kinds of things that can kind of help nudge someone along. But the worst case scenario is often, somebody doesn't want to go and they simply cannot stay. And in those situations, there can be just no real nice, ideal way through it. You just got to get through it and make decisions for them. And, it feels like you're pushing, and oftentimes you are, but that's the only thing that you can do to keep someone safe. And when those things come up, it can be about who has power of attorney, who's able to make that decision. I wish that it never happened that way, but sometimes when there are very serious safety issues, someone has to stand up, make that decision, and they have to leave their home. And it happens that way sometimes. It's hard, but thankfully you've got communities that are there to support you. And this isn't their first rodeo. They've seen people move in that don't want to be there often, and they can help, ease that along and make that transition as pleasant as possible.
Yeah. And just to, along those lines of, worst case scenarios, I've seen scenarios where a professional guardian has to get involved, which is a person who's assigned by the courts to make decisions for somebody. Those are really ugly, nasty cases, but it is something that can be done. Also a referral, if you know someone in your community that is unsafe at home and you feel like there needs to be an outside agency involved, if there's neglect or abuse happening in those situations, you can always call Adult Protective Services within your community, and those folks can get involved as well. Kind of takes it out of your hands as a family member and puts it into the hands of professional people who that's their jobs. So just a side note there to families.
Lots of options, but definitely, just dialoguing with the professionals out there in the field as to what those options are is going to help make it an easier road to travel for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Cynthia, so much. Another enlightening and resourceful conversation about some tough topics. So I really appreciate that. And I know our viewers do as well. So we will.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Love to be out there and helping keep our seniors safe and hopefully easing the burden for loved ones and family members as well.
Absolutely. Okay. We'll see you again soon. Thank you. Okay.